This is Art Is, a podcast for artists, where we talk about all things top of mind for emerging artists. I'm Isotta, and I'm an artist. I make sculpture, and I'm currently really interested in exploring how making sculpture with marble, a truly ancient material, can get us as humans in touch with deep geologic time. I'll be sharing more about my practice throughout this season, which is a new thing for me, because I started this podcast back in 2021 as a recent art school grad, grappling with starting my professional practice in the pandemic and feeling very lost and alone. Working on this pod helped me expand my horizons creatively and intellectually. So here we are, 3 years later, still making the show, but now with an amazing co-host.
And I'm Lauryn. I'm an artist and a career coach for creatives. I help artists and creatives master their mindset, align with their purpose, and make money doing work they love. Lately, I've been working on my acrylic and gouache cake paintings, and most interested in learning more about the intersection of emotional well-being and spirituality, especially as it relates to life as an artist.
Okay, well, welcome back to Art Is, a podcast for artists. I'm so excited to be joined today with our co-host, Lauryn, and also a special guest. We have Dr. Elodie Freymann joining us today, who is an artist and a scientist and has just an incredible journey and incredible practice to share with us. So, Elodie, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your professional creative journey so far.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on your guys' amazing podcast. I've had a very kind of winding path. I have sort of my entire life straddled the worlds of art and science, and kind of been pulled in both directions at various points. And so I've been in a more kind of science pathway lately, but it's really nice to be back talking about art and art practices. I'm from New York, and I was born and raised there. I have two artistic parents, both of whom worked throughout my life in the arts. I always kind of saw myself going down that route. Did a lot of art growing up in high school. I really saw myself as sort of becoming an artist when I grew up. That was my goal. And in the summers in my jobs, I worked in art studios. I worked as artist assistants. I worked in galleries in college. I worked at a bookbinding bindery one summer. So I really kind of started following that path. But I also had this second love that I didn't know what to do with. And that was my love of science and natural history. And I was kind of always torn. And I thought that this was a choice that I had to make between science and art. I didn't really see them coming together. And so I also, on the side in my summers, would take natural history jobs and science jobs. And I worked in environmental nonprofits, and I worked in herbariums. And I basically took any job having to do with botany that they offered high school students and college students. So I kind of felt like I was split in two. My passions were kind of divided. And then when I finished college, I went into documentary filmmaking because I saw it as a way. I felt very passionate about storytelling, and I wanted to use art as a medium to tell stories. And I thought that documentary filmmaking was a really nice way to do that, a visual way of sort of, illustrating what people had to say and giving people a platform who wouldn't necessarily otherwise have one. And so, I worked as a creative director and in the art department at a wonderful production company called Atlantic Pictures in New York City, and thought that I was going to keep doing that. I was super happy with it. But again, I had this kind of little voice on my shoulder calling me towards the science side and thinking that, okay, I can do art for the rest of my life, but I can't necessarily always switch into science. And that's not necessarily true, but that was my logic at the time. Sort of, if I'm going to do science, I have to go back to school, and I have to do it now. And I don't see myself doing that when I get older. So I moved to England and I started a master's in the UK. in science, in cognitive and evolutionary anthropology. And specifically, took that specific master's because they offered one course on primates. And I had been obsessed with primates since I was very little. And I thought, I literally Googled primatology masters short England, because I knew I didn't want to be in the US, because I didn't want to take the GRE, and I wanted it to be short, and I wanted to study primates. And this master's at Oxford came up. I applied, I got it. I fell in love with it the second I got there, and I thought, there's no way this is just going to be 9 months. I'm going to have to do a PhD. So, and that began my journey into kind of science, and I've been doing that for the last 4.5 years. And all that to say, throughout that journey, I thought that I was going to have to give up art. And I thought that that was kind of the end of my artistic career. But it was kind of the opposite. And I wound up spending a lot of my PhD time immersing myself in art, doing botanical drawings. I really dove into scientific illustration during that time. And I found art became a really important tool for me to kind of defeat imposter syndrome, if that makes sense. So there was a lot of things that, because I had more of an artistic background, I had majored in social anthropology, so nothing to do with STEM or hard sciences in my undergrad. And there was a lot I didn't know. I didn't know even how to identify different primates apart. I didn't know. I had taken botany classes, I had taken animal behavior classes, but there was gaps. I didn't, I came kind of with less academic knowledge than my peers. And so the way that I kind of tackled that was I would make art projects for myself. So I would illustrate. I tried to illustrate almost every species of primate to memorize them. When I was in the field and I had to memorize hundreds of plants, I started drawing them, and that's how I would really acquaint myself with them. I learned plant anatomy through illustration. I really kind of, that was the tool for me that got me through it. And once I draw something, I feel like I know it. And I feel like no one can take that knowledge away. And I have a very bad memory. I forget things the second I read them, but once I draw them, they're kind of with me forever. So that is a very long way of introducing myself, but that's sort of my story. And that's why I kind of, I still feel like I have a foot in both worlds, but I no longer feel like I have to choose between them.
Wow. I have so many questions. But it's so cool to hear your story and to hear kind of the journey that you've been on. And I guess my first question is just because I was thinking back to Izzy and I have talked about our roots, and I think there's these things that happen in childhood that stay with us, and denying them is really hard to do. And so I guess my first question is just about the chimpanzees. Like, why were you interested in primates, and like, what about that as a child was interesting to you?
I have spent so many hours of my life trying to answer this question, and I think I've come up with a couple of answers for myself. I mean, my kind of initial responses, I've just always been obsessed with them, and I think that obsession has to have come from somewhere, and I think that there's a couple of reasons that I fixated on primates versus all of the other amazing animals in the natural world. I think first and foremost, with chimpanzees specifically, it's a very unique case in which we have a very well-known mentor and idol, and that's Jane Goodall, who was a woman that did it, that went into the forest and without even a college degree, and studied chimps and really brought them to the forefront of the public eye at a time when everyone was scared of chimps and saw them as monsters and dangerous. And she showed the empathetic side, and she came in with an open mind, and that kind of created the field of primatology as we know it. And as a kid, I think as a young girl, having someone to look up to in a scientific field is incredibly important. And I realized that more and more. So I think that's one reason. I've been obsessed with Jane Goodall since I was young. I was her for Halloween many years in a row. I was really drawn to her work, and I think that is one of the reasons primates were really important to me growing up. But also before that, I think I was always, and this is funny, I think I mean, this is a very selfish answer, but I do think that this plays a part. I think you you start to love things that you're associated with. And I think that when I was young, I climbed and I walked really early, and everyone used to call me a little, like, a monkey. And I think that I started to associate that with someone who I was. And then I became, I just always kind of identified with monkeys, and I felt that I was drawn to them. And I think that there's something as basic as that, as something that you do when, you're 9 months old and everyone calls you something, but then you kind of wind up spending the rest of your life studying them. But I don't know. I do think it shows kind of how important those early core memories and associations and experiences that you have are for shaping kind of your path. And sometimes it's random, like primatology.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love you talking about having like an idol or someone to look up to kind of see to believe what's possible,
Yeah.
because sometimes it's hard when you have this idea or vision in your head and you have to believe so much for yourself to then create it. But if you can see someone else doing something similar, it almost gives you permission, or kind of like this, oh, okay, if they can do it, I can do it too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important for just seeing that it's possible. And obviously, you wind up charting your own path no matter what. I think both as an artist and as a scientist, you wind up, you have to be the first no matter what, because you're at, that's kind of the point of art and science, is that you're breaking boundaries, you're trying new things, you're coming up with new hypotheses, new methods, new approaches. But I think having someone that you can look at and admire and say, wow, like, yeah, it's possible. And it's funny with primatology, because what happened with that, and I mean, the second Jane Goodall kind of became the figurehead of primatology, it became considered kind of a soft science suddenly. And there's still kind of a lot, I've heard this in my career so far, people saying, oh, do you study chimps because, or women are good at studying chimps. There's a lot of female chimpologists because of you have a maternal instinct. You're, emotional, you understand, like you're tuned in. And this word maternal gets thrown around all the time. I've heard it, in the last 6 months, I've heard someone say this to me. So but really what that means is we just had a female role model, and, and more women joined. And now suddenly women are at the forefront of these amazing chimpanzee discoveries. And suddenly it has to be kind of put down as a softer science because of it. But it's absolutely not true. It's not a soft science, and maternal instinct has nothing to do with it.
Yeah. How interesting. And so, and just coming back to kind of like the visual, you were talking about remembering things visually rather than reading things. And it's something I've been thinking about lately too, of like psychic, just how our brain works. And some people get images, some people get downloads, some people get words, some people get feelings. And it was just occurring to me that I'm the same way. Like, it's hard when I read things, it's hard for me to remember, but visuals, it like plants something in my head, like the symbol, right? And that's
Yeah.
something that can translate through many different languages too.
Absolutely. I think, and I think about this point a lot, sort of what photography has done to our understanding of the natural world. And I think for me, the reason that visual, as I said, I mean, it's both a visual memorization tactic, and it also has to do with doing. I learn by doing. And for me, doing is drawing, or putting, pen to paper, or in my practice, I cut silhouettes with an X-Acto knife. And I really feel like it's that action of look closely observing and then translating and then cutting or drawing or whatever it is. That is kind of in that process, that's where I commit it to memory. And with photography, though it's a beautiful, beautiful medium, and it's incredibly important for capturing, scenes of the natural world and moments, and conveying that bringing that out of the forest or out of the ocean or wherever it is and showing it to people, I do find, and I take a lot of photographs, I do find that if I take a photo of a plant and it's not the same, I won't remember that plant the next day. It's really, it's for me, it's the time spent with that specimen in front of me, looking at each vein, each hair, each thorn. That's where it clicks for me. And I think we're very tempted with our, phones in our pockets and our nice cameras or whatever it is to take a picture and think we got it. It's in the bag, like it's on the computer, it's saved, it's backed up, but it's not here. It is to get it up here, you need to actually spend some more quality time with it.
That's so cool. It's so interesting to hear really like how much intersection there is between like the way you learn things and the way you think about things and the way that your like scientific and artistic practices have like evolved simultaneously. And I would absolutely love to dive into like the nitty-gritty of your PhD project and everything. But before we do that, I was wondering if we could like go back to something you mentioned earlier about this idea of imposter syndrome that you were having and using drawing and using your art practice and also thinking about that idea of timing that you were touching upon about how, if you wanted to go into the sciences, like this was the time. And it makes me think a lot about like the two different pathways that you've chosen, arts and science, kind of leading to a similar place. And I was going to ask if you found any overlap in terms of, I guess, the challenges that you face as a scientist and that which you face as an artist.
Yeah, well, it's a really good question. And I think about it a lot. And I've been thinking about it a lot now, actually, more because I've now wrapped up my PhD and I'm trying to transition back into the arts, into storytelling and natural history filmmaking, natural history visual storytelling. And so I've been really I've been thinking a lot kind of existentially about these two different, pathways, disciplines, practices, and there are so many overlaps. It's kind of funny. And as I was telling you guys before, when I was listening to your earlier episodes of your podcast, there were so many things that were applicable to me with my scientist hat on, that you were talking about for artists. And I mean, I think kind of one obvious similarity to me is just how much patience is, and I'll get to challenges in a second, or the similarities between the challenges, but I think in terms of methods and practice itself, that kind of meditative state that you need to get into as an artist, that you need to kind of have an obsessive personality. You need to be able to tune out the world. You need to be able to disappear and hunker into your art for, like hours on end, and the rest of the world fades away and it's just you and the thing that you're making. That happens in science too, at least for me. And it would happen in the field when I was with chimps. Sometimes there's lots of action, and sometimes, it's the equivalent in art, you have that influx of creative energy and you're making. And for me in the field, that's when the chimps are moving and doing all of these cool behaviors, and you have to be on and filming everything and writing everything down and taking GPS points, and like you're firing on all cylinders, you got to go. And then there are these moments where inspiration seems to slip away between your fingers and you really just have to work really hard and you don't see immediate output. And that happens in the field also with the chimps. Or with any sort of scientific field work, you have days where you don't find the chimps and you spend all day trekking 15 miles with a heavy bag and you're hungry and they don't call a single time. You just go home after, 9 hours of trekking and you haven't seen a chimp. Or you find them, but they're in the tree all day, not moving, and they're fast asleep. And you have to kind of make your peace with those off days and find beauty in them too, and realize that on those days, maybe maybe instead of spending the day upset that you didn't see a chimp and that you're not getting data for your PhD, and that instead of looping on that, you say, okay, I'm going to look under this leaf and try to find a cool bug, or I'm going to look for a chameleon, or I'm going to look for a snake, or I'm going to draw a plant, or I'm going to do something else. And I think on the artistic side, it's that lesson has trickled over for me in art. I mean, they fed each other, that same lesson, that there's output days and there's input days. And on some days where the inspiration isn't coming, or you don't have your subject you're supposed to be studying, you do something else that enriches you in another way, that keeps you healthy and happy and ready to output on a day when things are happening. And yeah, I think it's a universal lesson, and it's funny to see it translated kind of into two seemingly opposite, fields of work. Another one I had jotted down was, self-doubt. I think something that you have in both art and science is you are kind of the only person keeping it all in your head, and it can feel pretty lonely sometimes, pretty isolating. You feel like you're your own champion, and you have to self-advocate. You have to you're the one making yourself vulnerable. And you also have to, you question a lot of the time, in art, is this piece good? And in science, is my hypothesis right? Or am I totally off base? Like, am I running in the wrong direction? And in both of those cases, you have to be the one to talk yourself, down and say, yeah, I believe in myself. I back myself. Or even if it's wrong, we're here and we're going to do it. And also, just from a practical perspective, grants and funding and, showing your work in art, you're constantly applying and being rejected to grants. Same in science. Your whole career is applying for grants and being rejected to grants and picking yourself up and doing it again. And similarly with art, you're submitting your work to shows and galleries. And in academia and science, you're submitting your papers to peer review and to conferences. And you get met with a lot of critique all the time. And you just have to learn to accept the feedback, not let it impact your morale, keep going, back yourself again, and let that vulnerability kind of make you stronger, as hard as it is sometimes. So I could go on. There's like a million other things, but I think the takeaway is just they're so similar, and the lifestyle is so similar, and the beautiful parts too, collaboration, sense of community, the payoff when something goes well and you get, a piece in a show or a paper published, that make it worth it. But yeah, there's overlaps, and I don't hear it talked about that much.
Yeah, I love the way you described all of that, because it's so real. Even this morning, I was like, I woke up just feeling so frustrated. I've had 5 consultation calls with potential clients and all no's. And that rejection, I'm like, what am I doing wrong? What's going on? But it's like, it's having the patience. And then I was thinking, well, what else can I be doing in my business to promote myself? Like, I want this, I need this, blah, blah, blah. And then I was like, wait, like, what really brings me joy? And right now I'm trying to kind of balance more of like doing more of my painting as well. So that, and feeling into the belief that I can do both painting and coaching and being an artist and teaching. And so I noticed myself being like, oh, I can't paint anymore because I need to focus on finding clients. And then this morning I was like, wait, I don't want to be feeling this way. And I have this option of like doing something that I love and like spending my time over here and having that feeling of energy and purpose. Like, why don't I just allow myself to do that? So I loved how you described like even just looking at plants, like taking some time to like look at a bug, or like, just shift your focus. And I remember one of my coaching sessions with my coach, who she was like, think about all the days in the year where you have money coming in. even if you have like a corporate job, right? You only get paid twice a month. So that's how many days a year? And for some reason, or even like the days that you get a grant, or your book is published, or like those big kind of more monumental things, they're very few and far between. And so in the in between, it's like, how do you cultivate that same kind of energy where you're in awe and you're grateful and you're appreciative and you're curious and you're, all of these things. And so I loved hearing your experience with both science, because sometimes I feel like a scientist. I mean, it's probably a little different, but because I'm testing out things, but it's more about like spiritual, kind of like my beliefs and what my beliefs then create in my life. That's how I test things out. But that was really a beautiful description of your experience with it too.
Thank you. And I think what you just said really hits home. And I do think that artists are scientists, and whether it's, actual chemistry, mixing glazes and solvents and whatever it is. But there's what you said, I mean, about it's creative problem solving as a commonality. And I think something that happens when you're doing science all the time is, things go awry, and you have to uh innovate, and you need to improvise. And this happens all the time, whether you're, in a lab or in a field in the middle of a forest without access to electricity. You have to, something breaks, you got to fix it. I had so many contraptions of my gear tied together with hair bands and crazy wackadoo solutions to things going wrong, because you just have to. And the same thing happens in art too. You're cutting, for me, with my paper cutting, you cut, I zone out, or I'm listening to a podcast, or and I cut something, and then the whole piece of paper just falls out, because with my art, everything has to have a connecting point. And if you cut the connecting point, because all of my art, it's just contained in one piece of paper, the whole thing is ruined. And when that happens, which happens all the time, you just have to figure out how to solve it. Sometimes I glue it. Sometimes I totally change the composition around, and I you zhuzh it so that it suddenly makes sense. Or this person now doesn't have an arm. Okay, cool. We're gonna work with that. We're gonna put something in front of her. We're gonna collage. So I mean, there's that science of improvisation, of innovation. It comes in handy in kind of both careers and both lifestyles. And it's kind of the most critical skill, and I think, as both an artist and a scientist.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally resonate with that as well. And I think it's so great to hear all these different experiences that you've been sharing with us. And you're such a natural storyteller as well. So when it comes to both art and also your more scientific based experiences, and at some point I would love to go into more depth on your experience in the field, because that is just like so fascinating to me. I will link in this podcast the incredible short talk that Elodie gave at the Explorers Club in New York City in 2024 April, because it's so interesting and just like goes way more into depth about like her experiences, so people can check that out. But I found it really cool to also hear about how you have like consistently created art projects for yourself in order to learn or to memorize, or, to pass the time or whatever. And I was wondering if you'd be open to sharing some images with us, and maybe going a bit into some more detail on your art practice. And you've mentioned paper and cutting and all these different elements. So I personally would love to learn more.
Yeah, of course. Well, I guess briefly to summarize kind of what I've been up to, and then I can share my screen and show some work of mine from my website. I really like working um, in projects. So for me, I find more satisfaction from, instead of just doing kind of a solo piece that lives alone, which I've done plenty of, but I enjoy making a project. Maybe this is a masochistic side of myself, but if it takes too short a time, I feel like I could have done more. So I like giving myself a prompt that can then be expanded and expanded. And what I found was that lends itself really well to bookmaking. And because if you are making a book, you're not just making one composition, you're making a series of compositions, but when together they tell a story. And I've also found that that's been a really, really important tool for myself to catalyze, catalyze prioritization of making art in my day-to-day. Because once I start a project like that, I get hooked. And if I just have one, a one and done piece and it's done, then I might stop doing art for a while and go back to writing a paper or reading a book or whatever it is. So, but if I know I have this book project, I can chip away almost, like a sculpture. You're slowly chipping away until the book is done. And to me, that keeps me coming back to my desk, keeps me, picking up my cutting knife and keeps me going. So I have found that bookmaking has been kind of a very valuable tool for me, to just like beat, beat just the burnout, I guess, and kind of keep myself invigorated and ready to produce art. So, and what during the pandemic, it was also a very valuable tool for me. I was in one of those modes that we talked about briefly, when it's the down mode. I had time, I had bandwidth, it was a pandemic, so I had the opportunity. I was between my master's and my PhD. I was about to start a funded PhD. I knew I wasn't looking for a job. I was about to start this degree, and I had like 2 months, and all I wanted to do with those 2 months was make art, but I couldn't make myself do it. And I would sit down every day. There was obviously a lot going on in the world, and I would sit down and I thought, okay, I'm going to make something political. I really want to make political posters or a political book or something, to be involved and raise my voice. And I would sit down every single day, and I did everything, you're supposed to do to have inspiration strike, and it just didn't. And I was going crazy. And I called my dad, who's an artist, and I said, I'm going insane. I have all of this opportunity. I'm never going to have 2 months to do art again, like where I don't have to worry about anything else. What do I do? And he was like, he gave me this really important advice that I think about all the time, which is that, and we've talked about this, we've talked around it, but just putting it in these words really helped me, that there is input time and there is output time. And when you're in input time, it means that you're just taking things in. You are out in the world, you're open to new experiences, to conversations with people, to inspiration. And there's output time, which means you're more closed off to that. You need to be at your desk or in your studio making things. And he said that the most frustrating times in your life are when you want it to be output time, but it's input time, or you want it to be input time, but it's output time. And that was exactly where I was in that moment. Everything looked like it should be output time, but it wasn't at all. In my brain, it was input time. And he said, instead of sitting at your desk wishing it were output time, go input. You might as well. You're not going to output. So I was like, you know what? Okay, I'm going to give this a try. I put down my pen and paper. I didn't sit down at my desk again, and I just went out. And it was the pandemic, so going out was, walking around in a mask in the park. But I listened to music, I read books, I spent a lot of alone time, I did a lot of thinking, and suddenly I was in input time. I was in output time, sorry. I transitioned from input to output. And in that kind of wave, I made a book. And that's, I guess, what I'll show you on my website. And this also feeds into imposter syndrome. I knew I was starting my PhD, and I knew it was going to be kind of in evolutionary anthropology. And I didn't feel like I knew anything about, I had taken a master's, but I didn't really feel like I knew anything about kind of the evolution of life. And that's a huge topic, but I felt like, what is the evolution of life? When did life, how do we think about this? What is the geologic age? What is this? You hear things, Cenozoic, Paleozoic, you hear words thrown around, but you're like, you can't conceptualize chronologically what any of that means. We know the Ice Age, but we can't, I didn't at that point really understand when the Ice Age was. I know a number, but I don't, where was that in the course of life on Earth? So I made a book, and I'll share, if I hope this works, I'll share my screen now. Let's see. So, and I guess I'll kind of talk through it, or I'll pull it up and then we can chat about it. But yeah, so it was the evolution of life across geologic time. Is it coming through for you guys? Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, for me, I mean, this is just kind of, this sums it up. This sums up sort of why I do art and why it is helpful and therapeutic for me, and also why it's a learning tool. Because by actually, and I'll scroll as I talk, for me, really spending time doing this required a lot of research, which was kind of what I love to do also. So I knew, first of all, going into it, that I was going to have the Cambrian, the Ordovician, the Silurian, the Devonian, the Carboniferous, all of these ages to illustrate. So that box was checked. I knew I was going to have a big project that could keep me going throughout the pandemic. And I also knew that it was going to require a lot of like learning and a lot of Googling and a lot of reading articles and figuring out kind of how to place all of this and how to make sense of it and organize it in my own brain. So basically, as the book goes along, you travel through time and you watch life evolve from the earliest kind of Cambrian explosion, 543 million years ago, or 541 million years ago, to the present day. And you watch, trilobites go extinct. You watch lungfish develop. You watch the first plants emerge, the giant megafauna of the Carboniferous period. And then also on the top, I have labeled, because I never really understood extinction events. I knew about the big one, but I didn't really realize how many smaller extinction events there were. I wanted to know where in time those happened. So at the top, it says whether or not where the extinction boundaries are. You get the dinosaurs, you get the first birds, the first primates. And also, I will say that this for me was an incredible, incredible exercise for learning how to illustrate and cut new things, because I've been cutting paper since I was, I don't know, I think I started cutting paper when I was in 9th grade of high school, so maybe like 14. And I mean, I can talk about why cutting paper became kind of my medium of choice, but I've been doing it forever. But there are things that I just never figured out because I never had to. And water is one. I really hadn't mastered water. I still haven't mastered water, but I really spent time in this book because it's a landscape book, learning how to, water, leaves, scales, feathers, all of these kind of experiments. And I just learned about a lot of amazing animals. I learned about a lot about the history of plants, the environment, climate. And it was it was an amazing learning experience for me. So that's sort of a summary of the kind of work that I do and the projects that I enjoy taking on. Yeah.
Wow.
Amongst a few others.
Wow. So those are all hand cut. Is it black paper that you cut? Okay.
Yeah. So I cut black paper. I cut negative space out of black paper, and I cut with an X-Acto blade. And I first sketch it in white pencil, and I figure out the composition, but it's loose and things change. As I said, I make mistakes all the time, and I have to innovate and change plan and totally redo the composition as it goes. Sometimes you can glue things back together, but for the most part, once you make a mistake, it's game over. But actually, I mean, I don't think in my life I've ever restarted a silhouette from scratch, which I'm actually surprised to say, but I don't think I don't think I've ever scratched one. I think compositions have totally changed before my eyes, but I've always found a way to save it I mean, sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not successful, but yeah, it's the fun part for me. It's like, you know, the Sudoku of it, or the Tetris, trying to figure out kind of when you make a mistake, how to fix it and it still look okay. But yeah, so I cut everything I cut away is the white that you're seeing. But yeah, if you were to hold, and this particular book, each spread consists of 2 pages. But each page is self-contained. So if I were to pick that up, it would be one object and it would all hang together. And the difference, it looks a lot like wood cutting, but the difference with wood cutting is because with wood cutting, you don't need a connecting point. You can have, for example, you could cut on a wood block print a white circle, and then you could cut a circle around that circle, and there would be a black ring. You can't do that in paper cutting because the second you cut that wider circle around, the whole thing would fall out. Right. So that's the challenge, is figuring out how to have connecting points on everything that you do. And that's the fun of the drawing, the composition. You need to think, how is this whole thing not going to just fall out? But there's tricks, shadows are a really nice way of making things connect. Yeah, it's a new language, I guess. And once you kind of learn to speak it, it's just incredibly fun.
Yeah. And then I saw at the top, it said that it's a limited edition. Is that correct? And it's bound. How is it bound?
I got it bound at a bindery. So I enjoy binding books, and I've bound a few of my own books. And it's wonderful. It's just incredibly time consuming. And so for this one, I had this vision. So you can't see it here, but it's foil stamped in gold, which I didn't have the tools to do. So I worked with a very nice man in Oxford, who has a bindery called Green Street Bindery, and he printed 25 copies of this for me. And yeah, so the front and back cover. Oh, I have a copy here, but somewhere hidden away. Let me grab it. It's right on my bookshelf. The front and back cover are foil stamped in gold. I have a silver version here. I printed a few in silver just for fun, but yeah, you can see.
Can you stop sharing your screen for a second so we can see it closer up?
Yes, of course. Yeah, so it's the front and back are silver foil, and then you get the book inside. So I printed a few of them, and it was an experiment for myself to kind of make an edition and see how it went. And I mostly gave them away. I sold a few of them. I'd love to one day reprint them, but that was, it was more of, for me, an exercise and something to keep me going during my PhD, and a break from reading articles and writing academic journal papers, So it was more for me than it was for other people.
It's so beautiful. I mean, for those not watching, you should definitely go and watch, or check out the full book on Elodie's website, which I'll link below. But it's so incredible. I mean, I have so many questions. It makes me think a little of Kara Walker and a bit of William Kentridge, and there's just so many interesting inspiration threads there that I'd love to hear more about. But the topic is so amazing, because I personally have been doing my own research for my own practice into geologic eras, and I found it to be so confusing. So I actually read through your book, which was so helpful and just really accessible, and the imagery is so beautiful and just so much more interesting to look at than these I don't know, renders that are made with CGI or whatever, which we all want Jurassic Park and stuff, and the movies and stuff. But it's just really interesting to have a unique and artistic, creative approach to the topic. I actually am also writing about this in my actual newsletter that I was working on today, so it was really really top of mind for me. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear more about the inspiration of the project, and maybe I guess any other thoughts that you have around the experience as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, Kara Walker, amazing, has definitely been an inspiration. Also, Beatrice Carone, who's this amazing paper cutter based in New York, who I was lucky enough to be. I worked as her artist assistant one summer, which was one of those magical things where I had taken a summer job. I showed up. It was not how it was pitched. I really wanted to quit, but I didn't have a job. And I was Googling paper cutters because that was, I was really in my paper cutting era. I was in the end of college. And I'm still in my paper cutting era, but I was thinking I wanted to do this for full time. And I Googled, I had known Beatrice Carone for the longest time. I loved her work. She also does she does beautiful paper cuts. And I emailed her out of the blue and I was like, I'm looking for a job. I'm, 20 and it's the summer. And I was just wondering, I'd be willing to come to France because I have family in France. And she was like, oh, unfortunately, I'm not in France. And then she lived on my street in New York. So I was like, I'm your neighbor. And so I just worked for her for the summer and she was great and taught me a lot. And yeah, it was super fun kind of seeing what a paper cutting studio looks like and professional paper cutter. But actually the way that I got my start was in a funny way. How I picked paper cutting. My parents both work in the arts and they had shown me this, I think it was a cutout of Maxfield Parrish, who's one of my favorite painters. It was a sketch of his, but it was a collage, and it was how he was figuring out the composition of one of his paintings. And the way that he had figured out the composition was not by sketching. He had cut little characters and moved them around, and using kind of a collage, approach. And by moving them around, he picked the right composition and then he painted from that. And so when I started cutting, it was not because I wanted to cut paper to make the finished product out of paper. I was trying to copy his process to figure out composition for a painting. And so I kind of started cutting out pieces and scissors. I didn't like them. So I asked for an X-Acto knife and I started fiddling around. And then I actually had more fun cutting the individual components than I did painting the components in the finished composition. And I just kind of went off at that. And I've been doing it ever since. But yeah, I found this medium that I love that I've been doing now for really many years, from this kind of trying to copy someone's process and ending up with my own kind of medium. So it's funny when inspiration strikes and how.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear about how these kind of processes have been really helpful for you, like in the bigger picture. And you never really think about that. I guess like that input time as being as important as it ends up actually being. And I love that how the process of the paper cutting for something bigger ended up being the output itself, and so cool. And also such an interesting narrative. I see how important the like storytelling and narrative arc is to both science and art practices that you have. And I was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit more about how film has been coming into this for you. And I know you have a bunch of upcoming film projects. Maybe you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I would love to. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think for me, film has been a way of kind of bringing art to life, animating visual ideas, and combining it with storytelling. And my background, so in undergrad, I studied social anthropology. And really for me, what that degree was learning how to listen and acknowledge positionality, acknowledge kind of who you are and what person your interlocutor is talking to, how they see you, and how kind of your presence affects the stories that you have access to, and your interpretations. And really it was about subjectivity. I learned a lot about the lenses over my own eyes, and how I'm interpreting the world through conversations with other people and trying to be self-aware. And yeah, it was an amazing degree. And I think social anthropology it was a coincidence I did it. It was one of these other kind of random coincidences in my life where I was trying to study something else. I had to register for a major. I went basically first alphabetically on the list. Anthropology was there. I thought I was going to just do it and change out. And then I took an anthropology class and I was like, this is it. So but yeah, it was an amazing degree. But what it was just conversations, it's learning, it's hearing about people's stories and synthesizing and helping to convey those stories in a respectful way. And that translated really nicely into documentary filmmaking, which is how I sort of wound up in the doc world after college. And yeah, again, I loved it. I think film is an amazing medium for giving people access into parts of the world and people and places and ideas that are very hard to convey through text and very hard to convey through kind of two-dimensional art, or static art, I guess. And one of the reasons when I went back to school for science, I didn't ever think I was going to leave film behind. I was kind of, I went back to school thinking, oh, I'm going to go and get a scientific, I'm going to get my scientific chops so that I can go back and tell scientific stories through film. And going back to imposter syndrome, sometimes it can be really helpful in driving life decisions. Because for me, I just didn't want to have imposter syndrome anymore about the science. I never wanted to be on a film shoot where something scientific was being discussed and feel like I didn't understand it. I really, really wanted to cover my bases and feel like I had done the work and I could understand these things and I could be active in the conversation about them. But so yeah, I applied. So a big kind of a goal for myself when I started my PhD was that I didn't want to just end my PhD with texts and papers. I wanted to have some sort of visual translation of my work so that it could be more accessible. And academia, generally speaking, is a pretty inaccessible place. A lot of journals are, closed to people that don't have institutional logins. They're expensive. They're full of jargon. People don't read them. It can be an echo chamber. And there's amazing academics that are fighting that culture and who are producing, they're prioritizing scientific communication. They're making mixed media outputs for people in the, outside of academia. But yeah, that for me was a very important part of it. I didn't want to just go in, do a bunch of science, put it in a journal that no one reads, and let it die there. I really wanted my PhD to be translated into something that people wanted to engage with. And also that was really important for my work because I work with chimps who, are quickly disappearing. Their habitats are quickly disappearing. We don't have that much time. And why study chimpanzees? Why study this, amazing species that is our closest living ancestors on this planet other than the bonobo, and not want to share that information with the world? Like, we just simply don't have the time for the echo chamber when it comes down to certain topics, because by the time, people start caring about, by the time people find the journal article hidden in the gate kept, journal that you can't log into, then the chimps are going to be gone and the forest is going to be gone. And what's the point of doing all that work and pouring the funding into that research? So all that to say, I made it a priority that I was going to apply for filmmaking grants. And I did. In 2022, I applied to the Explorers Club Expedition Grant. And the Explorers Club is this amazing, amazing group. They fund expeditions, they fund scientific exploration and field work. They have an amazing grant program. And so I applied for a grant to bring a filmmaker into the field with me and film some of my research. And I didn't know at the time what the story was going to be. And it was actually funny. It was very last minute that I figured out what the story was going to be. And I guess I'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, so I applied for this grant and I got funding to bring someone. So I brought my college roommate, Austin Deary, who's an amazing filmmaker, cinematographer based in New York, an editor. And he came for the last 3 weeks of my fieldwork and we shot everything. And at that point, I had already been in the field the year before for 4.5 months. I'd been in the field by the time he came for about 4 months. But it was actually in thinking about what the story was going to be for this film that we had to make, that I actually kind of came up with the narrative of my entire PhD. Because I think I had all these findings and all these chapters and they didn't really seem to connect, but when I was thinking about what to make the film about, when I had to think about it as a narrative, I actually found that my PhD was a narrative. It was a narrative of kind of a slow journey toward building a case for the forest being a pharmacy for the chimpanzees. And it was kind of a personal story of kind of step by step. And what we wound up focusing on was this one tree and using it kind of as, there were many trees I was looking at and many plants I was looking at as potential medicines for chimps. I should back up and say I study how chimps self-medicate with medicinal plants. I didn't say that. I take that for granted now because I just talk about it so much. But yeah, my work focuses on chimpanzee self-medication. And chimps do self-medicate. They take medicine, which is amazing in the wild. And I'm going to talk about plants, but it's not limited to plants. They could, there's studies that show that they use insects as medicine and potentially termite or soils. And so there's a lot of amazing research on this. But yeah, I was trying to identify medicinal plants that the chimps use when they're sick. And sick here could mean injured. It could mean have a bacterial infection, a viral infection, parasite infection. So really, I was doing detective work. I was trying to be, a chimp detective, try to find which chimps might be sick, look at what they're eating, collect those plants, see if they have any bioactivity or medicinal properties, go in and do ethnomedicinal interviews with local healers to see if there's any overlap between the plants that we see being used by the chimps and the plants used in local medicine, in traditional medicinal cultures. So I had a lot of different, I was juggling a lot of kind of methods and had a lot of different kind of avenues I was looking at to build a case. And my movie winds up becoming about building the case for one tree called Alstonia bunai. And we had a lot of fun making it. We shot it. We're still in the editing process. We've just put out a little sizzle, a little trailer. And still kind of doing some fundraising to make the movie kind of come to life. We're aiming for it to be about a 15-minute documentary, but it was really just an amazing experience for me to learn that is what I love to do. Directing and producing and being in the field, like in situ, talking to people, figuring out the story, figuring out, what shots we need to convey the story and translating. It was a work of translation between my 300-page PhD and a 15-minute documentary that's mostly visual. And what information does there need to be? And importantly, what information does there not need to be? Diluting kind of the key points and the key takeaways and showing people why they should care and be as obsessed with self-medication of chimpanzees as I am, because I think it's the coolest topic ever, but it's niche. So it was an exercise in convincing people that it's important.
I mean, I have no words. It's so cool to hear the depth of the research and also the incredible crossover between, as we've already said, like the scientific and artistic experiences, in terms of accessibility of like science as a discipline, art as a discipline, the jargon that's used, the gatekeeping, the access, whether it's the cost of reading a scientific paper or attending a museum show or whatever it is. Like there's just so much crossover there, and I really had never thought about that before. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. And it's just incredible to hear about how much parallel there is between like the research side of your different practices, and I guess how maybe that's like one of the core links that you have, and how that has also extended into like your interdisciplinary and I guess more communal work with like bringing on peers and collaborators to work on new projects in film, which of course is really complex and requires often more than one person. But I was wondering if there was maybe any other images or maybe video or sound or anything that you wanted to share with us, maybe even from your website, which is just so awesome. I highly recommend everyone go and check it out. I'll link it below.
Yeah, I'm happy to share some more from my website. I'll show you that. And then I can also show you, I guess I can leave you with one image that is not something I made. It's very old, that sort of serves as my thesis and my I guess when I say thesis, I don't mean like dissertation. I mean like my kind of acting and guiding image that kind of keeps me on track and reminds me what's important. So I'll show you. I'll start with my website and then I'll get there. So let's see. Yeah. So I guess what I can also show you here is some of the botanical illustrations I've done while in the field. As I said, kind of, I've spent a lot of time throughout my PhD working on, yeah, sort of drawing what I see and trying to be kind of a conscientious observer and really taking time to study sort of specimens. And that has translated into, yeah, a lot of these kind of portfolio projects where I try to pick a theme and then run with it and use it as sort of, as I said, a way of kind of familiarizing myself with the topic. So before I started my master's, I was very, I wanted to learn the different primates. And I had loved primates my whole life, but I had never really sat down and tried to memorize all of them. So I was doing that and I was like, why don't I just paint them? So I did some paintings of all the different primates that I wanted to learn and had, a lot of fun getting really familiar with all of the different amazing primate species that there are in the world and how different they are. And I mean, the golden snub-nosed monkey with its crazy blue face and the Japanese macaques that sit in heated pools. And there's our friend, the chimpanzee, the gibbons who sing and the mothers teach their offspring how to sing their songs. I mean, it's also the stories, I guess, that you learn when you're, as you said, when you're researching. And I also really made sure to, in my early days of my PhD and my master's, I really wanted to make sure that I was practicing scientific illustration. So what I did for myself was I said, every Tuesday, I'm going to go to the Natural History Museum and I'm going to draw something in the Natural History Museum. And that really, I mean, so I would sit for like 2 hours at a time and just sketch different things. And that was a really, really that was a big jump for me in terms of my ability to kind of, yeah, I guess be comfortable sketching in pen, and not worry about making a mistake. And I think I really improved that year because I was putting in time and I was practicing on a really kind of regular basis. And I was really grateful for that later when I was in the field and kind of trying to draw botanical specimens on the fly. So yeah, I did. I can show you also some of the botanical work that I did when I was in the field. And this is also, I've tried my website is a funny kind of form of self-expression. I couldn't decide if it was going to be an art portfolio or a scientific field notebook. So it is both. You can really choose your own adventure. But I tried to record some of my adventures and what the point of my research is. And I tried to make it interactive. This is Ozzy. He's my favorite chimp. We had to learn all of the chimps. You have to identify all the chimps. So you have to learn all of their faces and how to identify them, which is part of the fun as well. But I'll scroll down here. So I did a lot of kind of quick botanical sketches in the field. And this was a really fun part of my research, was getting to spend time at the end of the day drawing all of the different mushrooms I'd collected, drawing the species that I'd been studying. This is Alstonia bunai. So this is the leaf of the tree that I wound up making my movie about. I had kind of day in the life sketches of camp, a gecko that I found outside my door. And it was part of my meditative kind of practice also of how to keep myself sane in the field and take alone time for myself, and alone time, but social time, because and this was a huge, actually, an important part of it, I think. When I was painting, people would come and sit down next to me at the field station, and I had some of my most amazing conversations with friends at the field station through art. And we'd start painting together, or they'd just sit and we'd have long chats. And I learned a lot about, the chimps, the forest, people's experiences growing up in and around the forest, through kind of just sitting and making space for people to come chat. So it was a nice way of kind of combining all of the things I like, talking to people and doing art. And then I guess I'll show you my short film, or my teaser is included in the talk that you said you'll link. So I'm not gonna share that, but I will show this image that I think about all the time. I think it's a really important image. Can you guys still see my screen if I do this? Okay, I'll try to walk you through it also. So this image, first of all, there's this amazing book called The Invention of Nature, which I highly recommend for artists and scientists alike. It's written by a woman named Andrea Wolf, and it's about Alexander von Humboldt, who was a naturalist in the end of the 18th century, early 19th century. And he was, to give you a sense of how kind of important Humboldt was at this moment in time, Darwin was reading Humboldt on the Beagle. So we now talk about Darwin all the time. Everyone knows Darwin's name. Not a lot of people know Humboldt's name, but I am the biggest Humboldt fan. I think he was an amazing, amazing naturalist. And Andrea Wolf really does a beautiful job of talking about his story. And one of the huge takeaways of this book is that even though he's like such an empirical scientist, he fully understood and recognized that everyone sees the natural world through their own glasses and their own lenses of experience, of background, of, knowledge, of relationships, of whatever it is. And that in this way, science is subjective, and that's a beautiful thing. And obviously, people aim for science to be as objective as possible. But Humboldt's point really is, or one of Humboldt's points is that there's an aestheticness to nature that it's deleterious to forget about. The kind of awe that nature inspires in you is part of the science. That nature can have that effect on you, that we as humans are able to, are as moved as we are, that beauty exists, and we see beauty and we recognize beauty, and nature does that to us. That's all science, in its own way. And I think about this a lot. And this image so Humboldt went on this very long expedition to South America, and he came back with millions of samples, and he wound up writing basically the rest of his career about this trip that he took. And one of his early books was called Essay on the Geography of Plants. And on the early pages of this book appears this image. And it was actually a dedication to, it says underneath it, it's cropped, but it says for Goethe, the poet, and they were very good friends, Humboldt and Goethe. And what this image depicts is Apollo, who's the god of music and art, which most people know, and he's unveiling the goddess of nature. And what Humboldt is showing here is that for him, and what Goethe showed him as a poet, and Humboldt was surrounded by, a court of artists, was that in order to understand the natural world and in order to understand nature, you really need art, you need music, you need, the humanities to unveil it for you, or else you're trying to kind of crack something with numbers that's uncrackable in that way. And I think about this all the time because in my field, it's a very empirical field. A lot of people are running models, and it's very quantitative. But for me, that was not the way to understand the natural world. And obviously you have to, and there's an absolute time and place for quantitative analysis. It's very important, but it's also really important to remember that for me, actually unveiling the natural world for me was a artistic process, not a numerical one. And so this is kind of the guiding image that I use to sort of refocus myself when I start, questioning whether or not I'm going crazy. I remember this, and I remember that this is sort of, some of the great naturalists were thinking like this back, a few hundred years ago. We've just sort of forgotten it over time. We've become very disciplinized, and art and science have become very separate. And you have to choose very young if you're going to be a scientist or if you're going to be an artist. And if you're bad at math, then forget it. You're not going to be a scientist. And if you're bad at drawing when you're in third grade, forget it. You're not going to be an artist. So it's the best naturalists, I think, are both.
Well, that's such a beautiful conclusion. Thank you, Elodie, for sharing all of these incredible stories and insights with us. It's been really so wonderful to speak with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Thanks for being here. When you have a moment, please leave us a rating or review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and email us at listen@artistpodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. Our music is by Black Wonder Twins. And now, a final message from Lauryn.
Hey, it's your creative career coach, Lauryn Hill. If you're ready to find more fulfillment and purpose in your life and make money doing work you love, I want to invite you to sign up for a free coaching consultation. In this 60-minute assessment, we'll talk about where you're currently at in your career and creative life. We'll get clear on where you want to go and what your vision is, and then we'll figure out what's getting in the way of you making it happen. After this intake process, I'll share with you solutions, what it would look like for us to work together, and how one-on-one coaching can help you create the results that you desire, but you have been struggling to create on your own. And if you feel like you're not quite clear on your goals yet, or don't really understand what coaching is, that's okay. Don't let it stop you from signing up for a consultation. I guarantee that you'll leave the consultation with more clarity on your goals and a better understanding of the profound impact that coaching can have on the rest of your life and career. So head over to curatedSplash.com/start-now. That's curatedSplash.com/start-now, and click the free strategy consultation button to sign up now. Hope to hear from you soon.